Hello, Kate from the Narrate team here. Continuing our series Drift, Adam looks at how easy it is to drift in our conversations to that of gossip. Gossip can be so easily addictive and enticing. How do we anchor ourselves in this area to avoid such a destructive vehicle? What wisdom does Jesus offer that will help make a change for the better?
So, going all the way back to Vision Weekend this last year, some of you remember we talked about this thing called the Rule of Five, and it's this idea that it's the daily that leads to the dream, and the way the daily leads to the dream is that you clearly define what do you have to accomplish in the day to get to the dream. Remember all that? And so I was thinking, so for me, there's two parts of that, two of my five, and I don't think every day I think in terms of like, I didn't make any sense. What are the five things we need to do every day? I don't think every day, I think 5 days a week, but a couple of the things that for me I have to do almost every day, 5 days a week, largely because of my role and because of the way I'm wired, is I have to run and I have to listen to a podcast. So every day I go for a run, every day I listen to a podcast, and it's, for me, some of the best time with the Lord that I have, period. But this last March, I hit this season, and those of you that listen to podcasts, I'm sure will be able to relate to this, especially if you listen to our podcasts. But I hit this season where I just wasn't getting much. Like, just wasn't much going on, not much inspiration, kind of dry, kind of like, nothing really connecting. And so as I was kind of struggling through that season, I thought, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to load up my phone with one of my very favorite communicators of all time, who I haven't listened to in a long time, a guy by the name of Rob Bell. Some of you will be familiar with him because I've talked about him. Some of you know his story, but he led a church in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I think was one of the very best thinkers and leaders in the whole world. And then recently kind of transitioned into a different role. He's not leading a church anymore, so he's not producing podcasts. So I loaded up my iPod with a bunch of podcasts from like circa 2005 and was listening to these on the run. And there was one in particular that I went back to several times. It was a podcast on gossip and on slander. And I was listening, this was in mid-March, I suppose, and I listened again another day, in consecutive days, and I was just gripped. I mean, I was listening to him and going, oh, yeah, I do that. Oh, yeah, I do that. Oh, ew, gross. I'm grossed out by myself right now. Oh, yeah, I do that too. And I was challenged and I was motivated and I was listening. And then the irony of it all hit me. Because what I remembered was we just finished a series called Speak. Remember that? With the Monty Python characters, with the butterfly coming out of the girl's mouth and the arrow coming out of the guy's mouth, and the death fell onto the screen. And we had this whole conversation for a month about the power of words and how our words create reality. We talked about James, and James said, like, words are like a rudder. They're like the bit in the mouth of a horse, or like the first spark of a forest fire, that they look seemingly completely insignificant, but they're incredibly impactful. We talked about how for better or for worse, words form reality. And that whole series, to be clear, was born out of about a year's worth of studying and personal kind of searching and learning that I'd been doing. And so here I was listening to this podcast on gossip, just a few weeks removed from a series, just a month removed from about a year-long studying process in my own quiet times, and I'm listening to a podcast on gossip, and I'm not thinking, oh yeah, I got that. Yep, got that one. Oh yeah, this is a piece of cake. I've been working on this for a year. I'm thinking like, oh, yeah, I do that too. And then it all just hit me like, oh, I'm such a hypocrite. I mean, I just taught this stuff. I just studied this stuff for a year. And here I am listening to a new guy talk about it from a different angle, and I do all of it. And then we started working on this series called Drift. And remember that what we've said is that you don't drift into anything worthwhile. That you don't drift into having better character. You don't drift into higher levels of godliness. You don't drift into having a better marriage or better relationships or a better job or better control of your finances. You don't drift into greater physical health. Like those things in life that matter. You don't drift, you make a courageous decision. Alcoholics don't drift into not drinking anymore, do they? Boom, no, they drive a stake in the ground, they make a courageous decision, and they say, I'm done, I've had it, I'm going to do something about this. And so we started this whole conversation because we recognize it's June, and we love summer, you love summer, and we recognize that it throws our routines up in the air, and everything kind of changes, and we love that, and we have embraced that into our culture around here, and yet it felt like an appropriate time to just look at some of the wisdom of the text that says, hey, hold on though, because if you're not careful, you can accidentally and yet very easily drift from where you were to this other place. And even physicists understand this. The second law of thermodynamics, entropy, that everything moves from order to disorder. It's just the natural flow. And you know this, if you lead a business or you try to keep a house clean, if you try to maintain friendships, it's just everything easily just gets messy. So we started, and Caleb did a good job of talking about just our thoughts and how easy it is for our mind to drift and for us to become all kinds of things mentally that we don't want to become. And then we talked about generosity and just that you don't drift into higher levels of generosity. Like those require decisions. We were listening to the radio this week, and I can't remember which one of the boys was in the car with me, and I must have been listening to ESPN radio because I don't listen to Mozart. I listen to ESPN radio. And they only say the same thing like every 15 minutes, but I don't listen to it that much. Anyway, they were talking about some particular athlete who makes zillions of dollars, and I can't remember how it came up, but one of the boys said something, and I said, well, the deal is it doesn't matter how much money you make, you'll find a way to spend it. And they were like, what, really? I said, yeah, that's why we do this whole save 10, give 10 thing, because if you spend every dollar of a $10 bill, then you'll spend every dollar of a $100 bill, and you'll spend every dollar of $1,000, they don't have a bill, and you make a courageous decision. I was having another conversation this week where I just remembered that a couple years ago when we were in the red and kind of going like, are we going to make it as a church? And I remember saying, listen, the degree to which we've been able to exist in the community the way we have up until this point is because some people back there, they made a courageous decision. They decided that they weren't going to drift financially, that they were going to be responsible financially, and that they were going to obey God with their stuff, and that they weren't going to give when what was left over. They were going to give first. And those of you that have experienced these last couple years with us, I think it's appropriate to say that like we exist because of the faithfulness of those people. And the reality is that what the next 5 year looks like will depend upon what we do in this regard. It would require a new group of people joining that group of people and go, no, I'm gonna trust God. I'm gonna believe that 90 is better than 100% of it. So my point is simply this: you don't drift into having better financial practices, do you? Last week we talked about prayer and the idea, and every dad in the room can appreciate, just there's so many demands upon life, how easy it is to drift with regards to just our leadership and modeling authority to our kids. Well, this morning I want to talk about gossip. Not from a like, hey, I've got this figured out, dummies. Not like from that angle at all. From a like on a daily basis. And I guess my awareness of that was heightened this week as I was preparing for this, just going like, this is so hard. And you know something, I think gossip is one of those topics that's really, really easy to see in others and really difficult to see in the mirror. Like it's really easy to be grossed out by a friend or a coworker and the way they're always talking about people and they're always dissing people and they're never saying things to people's face that they say behind their backs. And yet it's really hard to see that we're susceptible to the same things. Like think of it this way. How many of you guys think of yourself as a gossip? Just go ahead and raise your hand. Like, oh yeah, I'm a gossip. That's what I do. That's who I am. Wow, there's a few of you raising your hands. I am impressed. I thought I'd be the only one that raised my hand. Most of us don't. Now let me ask you this. How many of you can, when I say, do you know somebody who's a gossip, how many of you have someone that comes to mind? Like, do you know a gossip? Someone that always talks about people. You liars. You just... Someone pops in there, oh yeah, I don't talk to them about anything because the whole world will know if I do. Go ahead. Yeah. Now, let me ask you this. Do you think they think of themselves as a gossip? And if they don't, but you know they are, is it possible that even though you don't, you are? Uncomfortable stuff, isn't it? Or like, think of it this way. How many of you guys, like when you were making your New Year's resolutions, you thought, this year, I want to stab a really good friend in the back. Like, I mean, it'll be a good year if I've done that. Like, I want to get someone to think that I'm the type of person they can trust with anything, and that if I had something to say to them, I'd say it to their face, and they can count on me to approach them with issues. And like, I want to take a friend like that, and I just want to rip their heart out because they find out that I've talked about 30 other people about this issue that they have, but I've never pointed out to them. How many of you had that as a New Year's resolution? Of course not. How many of you have experienced that? Like there was somebody, and you thought if you could count on anybody, you can count on them. I mean, you know, like you can't, most of us. People ask me like, Adam, do you get a lot of criticism for Ales for Trails? And I say, well, not to my face. Like, I'm not an idiot. Like, that stuff doesn't always, this is kind of how we work, right? We don't always share stuff to one another's face. You know that. But how many of you have experienced like one of those people that you thought was a confidant, one of those people that you assumed that if anybody was going to point out to you that you had this issue, if anybody was going to say something to your face that needed to be said, you could count on them to say it, and then you found out second, third, fourth hand that everybody that they were talking with everybody but you about that issue. Ever experienced that? I almost started this whole conversation by saying, what were the most painful things you've ever experienced in life? And I'll bet you, for a good portion of us, one of those moments would be one of the most painful things. I mean, you've broken bones, you've lost jobs, you've lost marriages, but those moments where someone you thought you could count on betrayed, that's some of the most painful stuff you can experience. This happened to me 5 or 6 years ago. 2 people in my life very, very consistently. I saw them, if not daily, weekly. I had done something, and I didn't think twice about that I'd done this thing. My motives were clear, even though my actions might have been slightly stupid. And then about a year later, I figured out these 2 people were having all these conversations about this thing that I had done and how stupid I was and how ridiculous it was that I did that, and no one said a word. And when that all came to the surface, those were a few of the most difficult hours of my life. And those relationships still aren't the same. So let me ask you this. If it's happened to you, is it possible you've done it to somebody else? See, sometimes we talk about Jesus and we talk about like, hey, yeah, I mean, his life is the very best kind of life and it's kind of the easiest kind of life. And sometimes we're confronted by the fact that Jesus is difficult. And I think when it comes to our words and the way we talk about people and the way we talk to people, we're going to look at some statements from Jesus. And even if you don't believe that he's God, I think that there's incredible value from these statements. And I think what you're going to see is that he wasn't just like a good American. Like his way of life was tough, very difficult. There's a statement that he made, and that's oftentimes used. In fact, some of your Bibles, it'll even have a header above it that says like church discipline. But Jesus, he addresses his guys, and we're not even going to get very far into this because there's just so much here. But he says this, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the 2 of you. Let me ask you this, what's your favorite word in the English language? Have you ever thought of that? I hadn't before this week, but the more time I spent with this verse, I thought, I think if is my very favorite word in the entire English language. Because Jesus is going to make some statements here, and there's some principles we're going to look at, but if we miss the if, we miss the entire teaching, in my opinion. See, like if is rich with possibility, right? Like the reason if is such a cool word in my mind is because it's the graduating high school senior and all the possibility out in front of them. It's the person who gets a new job. It's the person in a new relationship. If is the passion of the entrepreneur, the inventor, the idea person. It's just ripe with potential and opportunity. It's inquisitive. Like if is a fun word, don't you think? But it's also humble. Like part of what makes it so rich is it's so aggressive, so hopeful, so forward-thinking, and yet if by its very design is humble, isn't it? Like if leaves room for, hey, but it might not work out. I mean, I got this business idea and it might not float. I've got this new hope for my marriage, but it might not take. I mean, I've got this career path that I'm going to pursue, but it might not happen. See, Jesus, he opens this passage on how do we handle, like, when somebody else is broken, when we have this perception that something might be wrong in the relationship, how do we handle it? And the first thing he says is if your brother or sister sins. Do you see how that impacts the posture? Like, hey, you looked at me this way, and I don't want to just assume something, because I might be wrong. Like, hey, there's this gesture you made or this email you didn't return. There's this habit that I see in your life, but I only see you for a few hours a week. So I'm just wondering, like, could there be something? Do you feel that? Like, it could be indicative of your heart. It could be a struggle you're having, or I might not have all the facts. Do you feel the difference there? In Proverbs 25, go ahead to that next slide. In Proverbs 25, it says, it is the glory of God to conceal a matter. To search out a matter is the glory of kings. See, it's like what the ancients understood, that wisdom and maturity is found in the ability to like mine out more information. Wisdom and maturity is rooted in like, I might not have all the facts. Wisdom and maturity is rooted in this idea of if. like, there might be this thing, and I'm going to love you enough to bring it up. I'm going to love you enough to ask, but I'm also going to leave room for the fact that I'm all wet here. Because otherwise we take fragments, don't we? And I'm sure we've all done this. We take these fragments and we construct this whole story. This is what happened to me several years ago. And it's all based upon this one, like, there was this, we start thinking like, I sent this email and they didn't return it, and it was like 17 minutes ago. And then 3 years ago they said this, and I've noticed you have this new affinity for the color yellow. Oh, I know. You've got an age-old vendetta against me. That's kind of how it works otherwise, right? Proverbs 25 says, no, like love them enough to search the matter out. Like, be committed enough to the relationship to pursue it. I think the if, so important. If your brother or sister sins, then make sure you talk to everybody in the office about it before you bring it up with them. Then make sure you load the bus and you call every family member, and you make sure that like every person in the circle thinks that they think what you think before you. Is that what Jesus says? Of course not. It starts by going, hey, then talk. No. Just between the two of you. I've noticed that there's this posture thing that can happen. Like we can say, what were they thinking? Like there's two postures. What were they thinking? Or there's what I think is the more mature posture. What were they thinking? What was going on? What was going through your head? What are you really up to? I've noticed there's this pattern, and what's going on here? What were you thinking versus what's going on here? What were you thinking? Wouldn't it be refreshing if you had more people who had the guts to approach you on the level of like, what were you thinking? I trust you as a business person. I trust you as a doctor. I trust you as whatever it is you do. I trust you. But so let me just ask, what were you thinking? Like, because I'm kind of thinking this, and I could be crazy. What were you thinking? Isn't that so much more refreshing? And if we don't, like if we betray Jesus like just between the two of you, then what do we naturally do? Because there's this, like, you have to talk about it, right? Like it reaches this point where some ideas, some concerns, some problems, some slights have to be addressed. And if we don't address it with them, what do we do? We go to someone else, right? And have you ever considered, this is one of the things Rob Bell pointed out that I thought was a really good observation, that when you go to somebody else, you very naturally turn your back on the person that you're not talking to. And they're not an idiot. They begin to sense that, right? And so if they don't reciprocate and do the same thing, Jesus says, what do? Well, then they do the same thing, and they go and they turn their back and they have these conversations. And listen, some of you, like when you go to the family reunion, this describes the whole dynamic. Or when you hang out with because all these people, they've got all these issues, and there's all these backs turned to one another, and it's just like 6-7 relationships deep, and nobody even understands it anymore. What if? It's like Jesus is imagining, what if there was a world, what if there was a community, that there were just a certain number of people who were so committed to the relationship that when there was the possibility that, they just went to him. They didn't drag in the whole office, and they didn't drag in the whole family, and they didn't make sure that they had everybody in agreement with them, and they didn't like relieve that pressure of having to say it by talking about friends, and then all of a sudden, oh, I don't need to say it anymore. They just went to them and talked it through. And then there's a promise. And it's not an absolute promise, but it's a hopeful one. Jesus continues, if they listen to you, you'll have won them over. Now, there's an assumption here, isn't there? Isn't there an assumption that we have the types of relationships that we actually go to each other? The assumption is that you're the type of person that would just as soon be approached. The assumption is that you're in relationships with people who would just as soon be approached. The assumption is that there's this desire for growth. That there's this assumption that when we're talking about it, we're talking about it not because we don't have anything else to talk about Friday night, not because we're bored as we're on a drive, not because of any of those things. We're talking about it because we're trying to solve it. It's a big, bold assumption. What if Jesus' way is difficult? And yet, what if it has a profound impact on relationships? The New Testament as a whole is, and this is where I'm like, the degree to which you feel a 2x4, like see it hitting me first, because I get this stuff is hard. But Paul, as he was leading the early church, was so hard on gossip. Listen, in Romans 1, he's listing out all these things like don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, like this will destroy community, this will destroy relationships, like just avoid this at all costs. I'm going to pick up in verse 29 and just look at this this is like the wanted board at the DMV. Watch this thing. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. See, kids, that's important stuff right there. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Whew. It's a heavy list. If you've ever read that, maybe you found yourself wondering, I know I've wondered this, like, really? Like murderers, God-haters, and gossip? Wow, that seems to be kind of incongruent to me. Watch this. The word translated gossip is this word. Go ahead, next slide. Looks like a dinosaur. It's plithyrcetus. Plithyrcetus. Go ahead. Pisiothitis. I mean, it's your first chance to cuss in church in a long time. So just go ahead. Say that word a few times, will you? Go ahead, try it. Say it 10 times. Can you hear that? The word means whisper or snake. You hear it? It's actually, do you know this? Go ahead, next slide. I learned a new word this week, the onomatopoeic. Is that how you say it? Onomatopoeic? You know what this word is? It's just like English. This is a word that the definition is the sound. The sound is the definition. So, coo. The sound and the definition, or bang. It's like next time you hear somebody gossip, because that's what you do when you gossip, right? Is you whisper. It also became associated with a snake. Now, if you're someone that has spent a little bit of time in the scriptures, what's the prominent snake in the biblical story? You find him in the garden. And just kind of come with me, whether you believe these are historical figures or not, just come with me. Evil, Satan, the devil, is embodied in the form of a serpent, commonly referred to as a snake. The snake has issues with God, frustrations with God, questions for God. What does he do with those? He goes to Adam and Eve, two people who are quite literally innocent. I mean, we say innocent and we mean it like none of us are innocent. They were literally innocent, pre-fall, pre-sin, pre-brokenness. And they go to Adam, he goes to Adam and Eve, and what does he do? Whatever the word is. Like, it's just, it's like a dinosaur. And he whispers in their ear. Because see, that's part of gossip, isn't it? Gossip is like pornography. Once it gets in your head, there's no getting it out, is there? It's just there. It's stuck. And this whole narrative bears itself out in Genesis 3 because now these people who, by all accounts, were perfectly contented with God, were well aware of his promises, were loving living in this world where God said, hey, you can have it all. Just stay away from that tree. That won't be good for you. Suddenly, they're questioning everything. It was like they loved their job. They thought their boss was a great person. They loved this friend. They loved this community. They loved this thing. Everything was going well. They weren't even suspicious of that person. And then suddenly someone planted a thought in their head, and now all of a sudden, their opinion is completely different. And what do? They act on what becomes what we now believe, many of us, was bad information. And the result was what? Well, for those of us that recognize Christ as Messiah, and those of you that are struggling with this, that's fine. We're not going to rush you there. But we would say that moment, that gossip, was at the foundation of what broke everything. And that might sound dramatic unless you've been a part of a family ripped in half by gossip. That might sound dramatic unless you've dealt with an organization that's been shredded by gossip. That might sound dramatic. Well, no, it probably doesn't sound dramatic to any of us, does it? Because we've experienced it. How one statement, one accounted for statement, one person who was whispering around the office changed the entire dynamic of everything. And so we go, wow, Paul, why is gossip and slander included with murderer and God-hater? And the more time you spend with it, you go, oh no, I guess that's not dramatic at all. That makes perfect sense. If God is a God who is about restoring and creating relationship, then it would make sense that gossip and slander is right at the core of what he says avoid, because it wreaks havoc, doesn't it? Rob Bell said that gossip is verbal porn. And part of what makes it verbal porn is, see, pornography is gutless because pornography, it wants the hit, it wants the adrenaline, it wants the rush, it wants the thing, it wants the feeling, but it doesn't want the commitment. It doesn't want the work of relationship. That's what gossip is, right? There's a rush. There's a hit. There's a boost of energy. There's this thing we feel emotionally and psychologically, and we love it, but it lacks commitment. We're committed to the idea of love, but not to the hard work of it. And so Jesus says, hey, if you get this thought, just go to him. I mean, if you can't decide that you're being emotional and psychoanalytical and hypercritical and all those things, if you decide like something's got to happen, just go and wrestle it to the ground, just between the two of you. And if you're in those types of relationships that want this, then maybe there'll be restoration, and if not, then maybe it's not a safe relationship anyway. So there's a couple pledges, couple agreements that I've been working on, inspired by Rob Bell and some of the things he said, that I just wanted to share with you. And because for me, they help summarize this and the difficulty of it. Number one, I shall always give the benefit of the doubt. I like the shall because it feels kind of official. I shall always give the benefit of the doubt. How much trouble would go away if you just assumed the best, not the worst? If you just assumed grace? What would happen if you just gave them the benefit of the doubt? What would happen if you were committed to like, and when I can't, then I'm just going to go to them? The second one, I shall be safe for those who are not present. I'm working through Stephen Covey's son's latest book, and he quotes his father. This is one of his father's mantras. Go ahead, next slide. He said, to retain those who are present, be loyal to those who are absent. It's brilliant, isn't it? Because you've experienced this. Like you know who to trust. You know who's safe based upon the words that come flying out of their mouth, right? Like you've seen this dynamic, and this is where I start going like, oh gosh, I am such a dismal failure on this. So the degree to which you feel that, like we're in this together. But I think if we're going to talk about drifting, if we're going to talk about how easy it is to get flabby, so to speak, if we're going to talk about how easy it is to move from this good place to this gross place, I guess I'm just assuming that we could all relate to, man, the way we talk about people can unravel very quickly. And you know, if you leave motivated and challenged to work on this, could I just remind you of one thing before I wrap up here? At the foundation of all of this, at the root of all of this, and everything Jesus is saying, everything Paul said, and everything James said, it isn't a God who said, now work really hard and get this right. Like that would be an admirable thing, but that's not the Christian thing. Christianity, I think it's important to be reminded, isn't a set of ideas. It's not a set of political ideas. It's not a set of spiritual ideas. It's not just another guru. Jesus wasn't just another guru saying, hey, work hard at this. Christianity isn't rooted in a set of ideas. Christianity is rooted in a day. A day where for 2,000 years people have said, that tomb was empty. And you go, wait a minute. Like, people don't rise from the dead and have a physical body again. That doesn't happen. Exactly. That's what the earlier church was saying. That doesn't happen. And the belief is, at the core of Christianity, is not a belief in a set of ideas. It's a belief in a day where Jesus, his messiahship was confirmed because his body in physical flesh rose, and people went, whoa, death just lost. The garden was just undone. It happened then for him. It happens for everyone who believes. And here's where this, I think, lands as it relates to speak. as it relates to our words, as it relates to gossip. What the early church believed was not that Jesus gave them a set of ideas that if they worked hard enough, they could somehow be like Jesus. What the early church believed was that in the resurrection and the power of the resurrection became available to you and I when we believed. And that it would be the Holy Spirit living through us, empowering us. Listen, I and you, we are so committed to creating a church that's accessible, that's non-threatening, that invites people into the conversation wherever they're at in the conversation. But we can't lose sight of the fact that it's not a set of ideas. It's a belief in a historical day. And if that day is true, then the power available to Jesus to physically rise from the dead is available to you to work on your gossip and slander. It's not a, now go work hard, you loser, and then you can be better and God will love you because you're better. It's no. God's power is available to transform you from the inside out. He will remind you, he will prompt you, and he'll even give you the desire to be a different kind of person. Listen, if you're here this morning and you're still trying to understand what it means to follow Jesus, I just want to anchor your thoughts to the day. I think of it in terms of, if the tomb was empty, then everything was different. And as Paul said in 1 Corinthians, if it wasn't, then nobody's to be pitied more than Christ followers, because then what are we doing? And listen, if you're thinking this morning of some habits that you have and some tendencies you have in a relationship, and you're a little grossed out by yourself, then don't wallow in that. Confess it to God. Acknowledge your desire for his help to make you better. And tell him you believe. And that you need the same power that rose Jesus from the dead to turn your mouth towards something that has a little bit more control.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.